welcome back on that excellent lecture. And I think we have definitely have some time for some question and answer with Doctora Pérez. Emma, I think there's something over your screen. Oh, there you are. Okay, we got you back. Great. Well, thank you so much for that lovely conversation with Maria Gaspar de Alba. What an interesting chat. You don't often get to be a voyeur onto a conversation between two academics geeking out. So really appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if anyone has a question, they're welcome to put it out over the chat box, and I'll field that for Dr. Pérez, or you can just unmute yourself, your microphone, and ask it. So the floor is open.
I guess it was self-explanatory. No questions.
Well, maybe I'll start with one.
Okay.
So I think the question of the way that we understand the past through the lens of the present, which obviously is inevitable because we are people inhabiting particular places and times. But the way that one kind of balances that, or weighs that in the balance as a historian, really came out in your conversation, especially in the beginning of all of this. So I was just wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that. You are a historian who writes fiction as well, and I have a sense that that might be some way that allows you some more creative latitude with all this. But maybe you could just talk about that.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's consistently, right? I mean, we don't often think about how much our own opinions, ideas, social construction, present moment affects the way we interpret the past, right? And we talk about that so much when we're getting trained as historians. And yet still we fail the documents. Often we fail the document. So we've always got to keep questioning ourselves. Okay, was this what was really happening? How much am I imposing myself and what I know and what I believe, right? And I think when I decided to write my historical fiction, I had to ask myself that a lot. But also, I think you just sort of take poetic license and you say, well, we're revising anyway. This is all about revisionist history. And how we revise has so much to do with our political, social, cultural circumstances, right? Yeah. How about you? Because you're a geographer, but you do a lot of history. So you're also an historian, really, as a geographer.
Well, I take that as a compliment, a high compliment. Yeah, that's a question that I think about all the time. I've been in a seminar recently with a bunch of historians from Mexico working on the question of property and land, history of Mexico.
Yeah.
And we're looking at old sources and new sources, and we're kind of creating a matrix of ideas and things. And we're stumbling upon some really interesting ways in which the Mexican Revolution shaped the work of historians following it. How so many historians picked up on a lot of the themes coming out of the Mexican Revolution, and a lot of them were coming from on high, from officialdom, and really affecting the work of historians down the road. So we're really grappling with all of those things, and then the way that the sources kind of course, very much dictate how we see the world and how to check against the biases of those sources. I have no easy answer. Nobody does. Nobody has an easy answer for that. It's just has to be kind of worked out in the doing. And I think that historians have to be very honest with their audiences and themselves, that this is actually itself a work of fiction in many ways.
Thank you. But a lot of historians don't. I don't want to step on any toes here. I mean, I am an historian, but I think often I might offend some of my colleagues. But I think that we forget how much our imaginary is constructing the way in which we're telling the story, which is probably why I resort to fiction as well, because I think that there is so much overlap. There's just a lot of overlap. And we try to be as true to the documents as we possibly can be. but I am not one to think that, and this is probably really old school, that the documents speak for themselves. I mean, yes, in some way they do, but someone's always interpreting those documents. The historical moment says so much about how those documents are going to be interpreted and by whom, right?
Yes, right. And so that really affects how we read, of course, as readers of history.
Yeah.
You know, we've got a question in the box here, bringing us back to the topic at hand, La Malinche. It's from Angelita, but for some reason I don't see, let's see if I can understand it. I was hurt by the idea that Malinche, La Virgen, and Sor Juana were the women.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Angelita, are you still here? I don't know if she's still...
The common women of our indigenous nations are the important ones. Yeah, I mean, yes, the common women are the important ones. Absolutely. I would not disagree with that by any means. So why do we look at the cultural icons then? I mean, I think the question then becomes, the cultural icons are the ones that are marking people's personalities, they're marking the terrain, right? But we need more work on the common indigenous women, absolutely. And this is why we need more scholars, we need more studies, and we don't have enough of them. We really do not. So
how do you do that work? The sources obviously are largely official sources that have a lot of erasures. You know, they erase non-elites often. So how do you do that kind of work?
Well, I think, in the case of indigeneity, oral tradition is so important, right? I mean, because of the manner in which so many groups have their own oral historians, oral storytellers. I think it's interesting too, when you think about the history itself as a discipline didn't really legitimate oral history until the 1970s, which
Wow.
speaks so much about the manner in which the written word is taken at word, rather than the fact that people's stories, I mean, even when you go back to the conquest, Sepúlveda, right? Was it, God, I forget his name, who's the one who took so many of the, had the indigenous in the 16th century write down their stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was Sagun, I'm sorry, it was Sagun's informant. Yeah, and Sagun's informants. And this was incredibly important to tell the various perspectives of the conquest, right? And of course, it wasn't done until 30 to 50 years after the conquest, but still, people's memory, the importance of memory, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, and memory is political as well. You know, the way that things are remembered. Obviously, we're experiencing that all the time.
Yeah.
I have, let's see here, a question from Joanne, asking about how do we fund the work of these historical studies. Yeah. That's a great question.
Good question. We pressure our universities to hire more scholars who are indigenous scholars, who are Mexican American, Chicanx, Latinx. I mean, we need more scholars who are studying and who are studying these sources, and also who, we need to transform these universities. We need to transform the departments as well in the programs and legitimate the study. So then we can begin funding them more and taking them more seriously. But it's an ongoing battle. I mean, I've been doing this for 35, almost 40 years of my life. And I think that the battle continues, as we well know. You know this too, Jeff. I mean, having seen and certainly from your own studies. But yeah, the work on historical studies, it's just, there's so much that has to be done. Yeah.
It's not easy. I know that I can say it's not easy to get funding for historical work, for work that works from a humanistic perspective. Many of these things, we end up just doing them very piecemeal, getting small grants here and there, right? We travel on our own dime often. We have networks that we draw from. We share information, a lot of us, I think. We look for sources that are as local as we can get them sometimes. University of Arizona Special Collections is a treasure. There's a lot of amazing material there. But yeah, it's not an easy thing.
Yeah.
Let's see, Angelita has raised her hand. Go ahead if you'd like to unmute yourself, Angelita.
Hello, it's wonderful to participate in this discussion, and I'm just really moved to say that I am of the opinion that we need to change what is legitimate. Professor Pérez used the word we need to legitimize.
Mhm.
And I think that, you know, we're in a position now to not only look for people who have PhDs and have studied this through the lens of the academy. Are some models, I'm thinking of one, the Ethnic Studies Association that I think is based out of Canada, that acknowledges community scholars. So these would be the elders in my own community who we hold in respect, and we know hold the origin stories and the native science that we have survived by. So we're the empirical evidence that what we're doing works, because I'm still here. So I think the switch, excuse me, finish, Senora Perez, thank you. I think that the paradigm shift needs to be towards the community scholars and the idea that there is a living history. You don't just study indigenous peoples as a long, great nation, because that's what I experience is people want to know the history of these great lost nations, and they don't want to know about what's happening right now. Like your presentation about what was going on in the coastal deserts was beautiful because it brought forward the holders of the indigenous knowledge, and it wasn't about what the SETI were doing before or their history, it was a living history. So I think binary here between what's being presented, it's not an either or. I think it's a coming together of community scholars who hold knowledge based on the oral tradition in conversation and dialogue with our Malinche, who have wonderful skills of translation, because I don't hold that word as a pejorative. I think Malinche had great skills and she used them however she could. And I think there's a bigger picture that I believe I hold in listening to this beautiful discussion that I wanted to share. I'm an Indigenous woman and I am viewed as a Native scientist, and I would love to contribute in any way. So I'm choosing to be here and speak this morning. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Angelita. Yes, I would agree on every point. And I think that, you know, when I mentioned the 1970s and how oral history, oral tradition wasn't taken seriously in the discipline of history, I mean, that had to be worked against. And again, the argument there was that we have so many people in the community. We have so much history that is given to us that is reconstructed from our communities. And unfortunately, you're absolutely right. Why does it have to be legitimated by the university? I would absolutely agree with that. The difference there is that I just believe we need us everywhere. And I think the institutions, these legitimated institutions, and I say that in quotes when I use that word, these legitimated institutions are the ones that usually get the funding, that usually get the privilege and the prestige, right? And that has to be funneled to communities, absolutely. And we're in a crunch once again. I mean, I come out of the 1970s and 80s when there was probably a little more funding for ethnic studies and Chicanx studies and Native American studies and women's studies and queer studies. And we're in a crunch once again when we're having to battle that out. And so I really appreciate your taking the time to be here, by the way, and to give your contributions, Angelita.
I second that. Thank you so much for that comment. Very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add one quick thing. The work that I've done in Mexico, some of which has been with indigenous peoples in the Mayo Valley and other places, there is so often a kind of a village cronista, a chronicler, you know, a local historian who is a kind of organic intellectual that emerges out of the firmament of the place. And those people are incredible. And I think a lot of the Mexican historians that I've worked with go straight to them often and have really long-standing relationships with them. It's a really, it's a lovely thing. But the kind of the professionalization of any of these intellectual pursuits, I think has to be questioned in many ways. I'm not saying it's a bad thing on its face, but it needs to be, I think it kind of the model needs to be sort of exploded and made accessible and much more entwined with the rest of the world than it is. It's not set apart. I agree with that very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone else want to speak or ask a question through the chat box?
There's a group over there that's eating and they're making me hungry.
I'm so glad you chose tacos de huitlacoche for your for this presentation. That was a great choice.
Seemed to make sense. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's what an epic story that you were talking about. Just the conquest of where did Emma go? Did we lose her? Oh, there you are. You bumped around.
Yeah.
The conquest of Mexico. Obviously that's a very blunt term, but Cortez's sweep into Tenochtitlan and the different factors that made that whole thing that probably shouldn't have happened in many ways made that possible. It was so, he had so much luck, Cortez, to put it simply, but there was a lot going for him and a lot of things converged to make that happen. But I so appreciate getting a much more diversified view of Malinche, because I too had a lot of exposure to Octavio Paz and others who talked about Malinche in that particular way, and you can see that symbolism, the objectification of her running across popular culture and art and history and many strands of Mexican nationalism. So it's very important the work you're doing here. So thank you, Emma. I don't know if you'd like to make some final remarks here.
No, I thank you everyone for listening in, for your comments. And yeah, I mean, why do we study cultural icons? I think that focusing in, and when I teach my students about the cultural icons, I think that I want them to see the manner in which they impose and impress so much upon people's minds and about social relations, political relations, right? So I think that's why I thought it would be kind of interesting to have a conversation about someone like Malinche. But thanks again. It was fun. It was fun to do.
Great. Well, thanks to the rest of you all who have participated in this lecture series, our great experiment. We're so grateful for you and having for all of your time here, and also your contribution, which we'll be making a donation to the COVID relief effort in Seriland here very shortly with the monies that we've raised from all of this. So we are incredibly grateful to all of you. So we'll see you when we do this again, sometime down the road. And we welcome your comments and feedback too. You can send those to Carlos Quintero. And Carlos, thank you too for all the work that you've done on this.
Adios.
Adios.